Hola, fellow Latinx. I'm told that white people should not be reviewing Andor because Andor is about the migrant experience, and white people famously never move anywhere beyond their home countries, so I bought a little rubber dinghy and I made an illegal entry across the Rio Grande, where I was given a free cell phone by the American government and a nice Florida man flew me to Martha's Vineyard, and the people there bought me Chipotle and they bussed me over to diversify a military base, and AOC is now crying for the television cameras outside my window. Would anybody like to buy some fentanyl? Now that I have the migrant experience, I think I'm allowed to review the show. That's how this works, right? I'm sorry to reveal that I am, in fact, a white person. I know it's going to come as a shock. Mine is the race of socks and crocs, Coldplay, and Mormonism, and for these things alone, we do probably owe reparations, so get in line. Of course, none of this has anything to do with Andor, because Andor is a TV show, and thus it's subject to the universal rules of art criticism, which owe absolutely nothing to whatever your tribe, skin color, sexual orientation, or preference for dildo shape happens to be. No matter what shameless grifting morons like Mr. Rocker here would have you believe. The only thing that makes him and his type relevant is the as yet open question of whether this show has been written for people like him, by people like him, and whether a once timeless property is once again going to be conscripted into an obsessively modern and current political argument. And that is one of the many questions we will set out to answer here. But as is usually the case on this channel, I will put as much of the pre-publicity material as possible out of my mind and look at the show afresh. This might not be as long or as in-depth as my other recent videos, because Rings of Power is still using up about 98% of my capacity for stupid, and I have many hours of that to get back to once this video is up. The worst that Andor can provide is some variety to the dumb fuckery I'm drowning in. So let's get on with the plot. The opening is not dissimilar to Andor's introduction to us in Rogue One. He's malingering around the dimly lit streets of an alien world, though on this occasion he's heading to a seedy nightclub rather than murdering injured extras. Yet. One slightly bizarre thing I noted at the beginning, generally, even in the shittest of Disney Star Wars products, there's been quite a lot of use of established, lore-relevant, or at least lore-derived sound effects, and quite often these are fine, I guess. It is nice to hear the occasional 8080 cannon from time to time, even if they do sometimes decide that pistols and handguns make the same noise. If you listen closely as Andor enters this club, though, you hear what I'm quite sure is the soothing sound the medical droids on Polis Massa make to ease Padme through her birthing pains.
No credit, no nonsense. In you go.
I've no idea what function this would serve in enticing people through the doors of a nightclub, but, well, it's an Easter egg, I guess. I thought I'd note it. The bar itself is like something out of Cyberpunk or Mass Effect, maybe. We will come back to the question as to whether this show really feels like Star Wars a little bit later on. In the meantime, Andor is here searching for a contact or a person. He makes eye contact with a couple of the club's clientele. They seem to take offense. One asks,
"Is there something amusing?" "What?" "You keep looking over it like there's something funny."
I genuinely don't know how they got that impression. One of the consistent problems throughout this show's first 3 episodes is that Diego Luna, who of course plays Andor, doesn't really do facial expressions at all. As far as looks go, the one he gives the 2 thuggish types is, I'd say, vague boredom, and even that's a bit of a stretch. It's not a significant flaw by any means, but, and as I've made this point in relation to things like Rings of Power, it is often worth noting little things like this about the writing, because they're very rarely isolated moments or just blips in the script. The writers here wanted to manufacture a grievance, and that's fine. It's a common trope for the lone gunman in a seedy bar to fall foul of some of the clientele. But the writers were very keen to get to that trope, and they didn't pay a huge amount of attention to how you construct that trope. Simply swapping the dialogue for a vaguer, "do you have a problem?" would have made a more believable exchange than, "you keep looking over here as though there's something funny," because well, Andor doesn't do funny. That's not how his face works. We'll come back to this if the problem recurs. It may or it may not, but again, it's not a nitpick if it does establish a common theme in the writing. They have fast-tracked their way to this exchange in order to achieve a setup. They didn't really earn that setup. In any case, the argument is interrupted when we learn from the bar matron person, head Prozzer, I guess, possibly, I think that's her role. We learn that the person Andor is here looking for A isn't here, and B is his
Sister.
Man looking for a estranged sister in brothel is certainly a new one for Star Wars in terms of tone and severity and implication. Andor leaves the club, but he's being tailed by the two thugs, and they're spoiling for a fight. The goons are sentries or guards employed by whatever company runs this town. And besides the tonal difference, I think this counts as another newism. Andor is, after all, set in the early-ish stage of the Empire, and it promises, as other shows have promised and failed to deliver, a look at how the galaxy actually operates under this system. I made this point the other day on the Drinkers Open Bar, and it might recur later, but this seemingly small thing is actually quite promising from a world-building perspective. For far too long, we've been left with the impression, by the shows and movies, I should stress, not the games or the old EU, which did this rather better, but by the shows and the movies, we have been given the impression that the Empire just kind of is, that it can make do with stormtroopers as enforcers, and that's about the extent of it. We get hints in the original trilogy about some of the other political and regional power relationships. Moff Tarkin mentions the regional governors, and more relevantly here, Lando has a deal with the Empire in Empire Strikes Back. But besides those, we haven't been given all that much about how the Empire really operates and what extent it's infiltrated these worlds and what relationships these worlds actually have with the Empire that governs them. What you want from a fleshed out universe, as I said on Open Bar, is more of this kind of thing. Tyrannical empires are more than their soldiers and police. They have unique and interesting relationships with the territories that exist under them. Much of law enforcement isn't the top-down imposition of troops on the ground, it's the long-established local forces that have been put to a new purpose by this new governorship. The chief practitioners of political and civic violence are not occupying troops, they are small-minded locals grasping at power under the new order. Fascist regimes, and communist ones too, often do deals contracting out governance to corporations and business interests in areas of the world they're just not that interested in. And this seems to be the arrangement on this world, between this world's governors and the empire that governs them. The show gives us quite a lot of this kind of detail across these first 3 episodes, but it really starts here. Andor isn't accosted by troopers. He's offended grasping micro-megalomaniacs in a bar, and they're abusing their authority to pursue a petty grudge against him. And this makes for a good start, I'd argue, as far as world building is concerned. He offers to bribe his way out of trouble. They say it won't be enough to cover the fines and charges and the processing fees, and they seem to be looking for an excuse to kill him, or at least to fight him. But he pulls a fast one and gives us yet more evidence for a quite significant tonal shift this series has in store. Because the brief fight scene is more grubby and physical and brutal than we're used to seeing, resulting in Andor accidentally killing one of his assailants and then holding the other guy's life in his hands as he begs for his life, only for Andor then to shoot him in the head. So far, so good, I'd say. A lot of the introductory episodes to recent Star Wars products have left me wanting to shoot myself in the head. We got a hint of this side of the universe in Rogue One, but the film had other and, I think, more typical things to do than follow through with this exploration of the dark side, to borrow a phrase, of the galaxy it was set in. As someone who thinks Star Wars does need to prove A, that it's bigger than the Jedi, and B, that it has other kinds of story to tell than the grand narrative of the saga, well, this strikes me as a daring and, if many other pieces fall into place, quite a good approach to take. The next day, his droid tries to wake him up, but we get a flashback dream that brings back traumatic memories of the Book of Boba Fett. This is of Andor and his sister as wastrel kids in a wastrel community somewhere beyond civilization, who see a spaceship crash away in the distance. Compared to Boba's interminable dances with Tusken's timeline, this flashback is mercifully short. We'll almost certainly be coming back to it periodically as the show progresses, building up his relationship with his sister and telling the story of her disappearance. If the show thinks it's clever, and there are indications across these episodes that it does, I wonder if it won't try and retcon in a kind of psychological affinity with Jyn Erso in Rogue One, one that maybe explains Andor's coldness but then his quickly developed fondness for her, another headstrong young woman. That said, given Andor and Erso would likely have boned on the beaches of Scarif if the Death Star hadn't shot its load and obliterated them, maybe that is not an association you'd want to, probe too deeply. The other thing to note about this flashback is that the kid they've got to play young Andor appears derpy and chosen because he, too, has very few facial expressions to speak of. That's not especially encouraging, but I guess it's consistent. Back in the present, the droid succeeds in waking him up and tells him someone was looking for him. He asks the droid to lie and tell anyone who asks that he hasn't seen him, and they have some semi-entertaining exchanges. The droid isn't anything like as engaging or endearing as K2 was in Rogue One, but if it becomes a recurring character, it seems that the show is setting up a similar relationship, and there is some material in the droid that they could play off for laughs. We'll see how that develops. Although the other thing this scene accomplishes, I suppose, because the droid agrees to lie for him, is that droids in Star Wars do not operate by Asimov's laws. Anyway, modern Star Wars has a weird knack for giving us shite humans but nice droids. I think the only likable character in Kenobi was Calculon, so we'll see if this trend continues. Andor goes to meet a construction worker friend because he wants to build an alibi for the night of the murder. And I know this might sound like I'm damning the show with faint praise, but I think this actually constitutes the most intelligent setup of any Disney Star Wars show. This show is manufacturing stakes. It's manufacturing a relationship between its protagonist and the mechanics of his world. Yes, that sounds simple as fuck, but so few shows care about this kind of thing that you kind of have to savor setups when you get them at all, especially when the show in question is a Star Wars show, because usually all we get from these is member berries, McMuffins, and McFucking about stupidly. Shows are often made by these little things, and we do get some more of the good stuff in the next scene, away at Corpo Central, where we're introduced to Cyril Khan. I'm not going to be able to get through this review without doing this. He's a deputy inspector in the Corpo security force, and then, endearingly, we have Rupert Vanistard's cynical and wry Chief Hine. Vanistard is almost always great value, I've noticed. He's one of those yeoman actors you're always quite surprised have never made it into a big budget production. Although, that being said, he's now had a bit part in Game of Thrones as is it Jon Royce? And he's now being cast as a presumed villain in Andor, so it feels like he's finally getting some more mainstream attention. He doesn't have to be even an especially prominent character in this role for his good work to be recognised, however. This is once again new ground for Disney Star Wars, a villain who actually has a personality. The Last Jedi pretended to be clever in having the stuttering arms dealer play a dumb fucking pointless role in its plot, but because Rian Johnson has all the wit of a gonk droid, his attempt at introducing a moral grey character just ended up reinforcing the film's staggeringly shallow understanding of itself. But in Hine, we get A, an actor with the gravitas to pull off the role, B, a role that, though a bit stereotypical, cynical world-weary police chief, is nonetheless a stereotype absent from modern Star Wars until this point, and more nuanced than all the other stereotypes that are stereotypically deployed, and then C, a character who, because he isn't just an evil henchman or an outsized evil character, actually allows us to feel a greater range of emotions for him. We can appreciate his wry humour. We can even find his sardonic exchanges with his underlings quite entertaining, even endearing, because he's a relatively normal guy. He's a type most of us know in real life. He's someone we can actually like, as well as despise, because he is familiar to us. If there's a downside, it's that Vanistard looks set to steal pretty much all of the scenes he's in. He's actually quite a good actor. And of course that means he risks stealing the scenes from more plot-relevant characters. However, in their first exchange, Andor does create a dynamic between Hines and that could, if the show continues in this fashion, create a complementary relationship between the two. Hines the gruff, seen it all before, cut to the chase, I can smell your bullshit from miles away veteran, and Khan the more prim, proper, naive, inexperienced, and comparatively dandified junior. The Mandalorian is the only other Disney Star Wars show that comes anywhere near to creating actual character relationships. Not coincidentally then, it's the only other show that, for all its frequent recourse to idiocy in its plot, does actually feel like it has a semblance of a story and a few chunks of a fully fleshed out world to play with. So Andor has started off on the right track here. They are talking about the murder. Khan wants to do the proper thing and investigate it thoroughly. Hines, though, essentially says the two guys were fucking morons and a liability, and it would be altogether more convenient just to officially declare it an accident, not least because he has to give a report on crime rates to Imperial Regional Command later that day. And I know it's unusual on this channel, but hell, there's more praise. The dialogue, well, it's actually kind of witty. It's actually related, portrayed, conveyed quite well. It actually establishes character and the relationship between character and the world they're set in.
I know one of these men. Crevasse.
It's another reason I wanted to make sure this got the most immediate attention.
He was a squad commander on 4.
It's obviously fallen a great deal since then. He was a sentry corporal here on 1.
No mystery there. He's lucky he wasn't killed years ago. One of the most unpleasant people I've ever met.
It's another example of what I mentioned earlier, the believability of an insignificant Imperial world and the Jobsworth who are in charge of running it. These guys are believable. Their relationship with power is believable. It creates a believable dynamic that's been missing from Star Wars for pretty well the entirety of the Disney era. I think that counts as good in its own right, and not just by comparison. Of course, it's very good by comparison with other Disney Star Wars shows. Maybe it's too early to make a definitive judgment of this show in its own right, but the groundwork being laid is promising, without reference to other worse product. Meanwhile, Andor goes to a repair shop looking for a pretty lady whom he finds fixing an engine. I know some people will look at this character and smell bullshit from the off. Yes, women in the real world can be mechanics, of course, but it is atypical. Strong women doing men's jobs is a common trope in modern media, and usually it's done to make some kind of tedious gender politics point. So I get it if you are put off by this introduction. But I'm also loath to dismiss the mere setup because you can do this believably in-universe. It all depends on the specific character and how she is going to be written, so I think we should give the show a chance. Weirdly, and I don't think I'm being overly charitable, the show has actually earned the chance so far. Andor is trying to flog her some highly sensitive piece of kit, or rather, he's trying to flog it to a contact that she knows. He's had it hidden for a while, he now needs to shift it quickly and relocate himself to escape the murder charge that's, well, it's not coming, but he doesn't know that. She's not happy about this. She offers to buy it herself, but he's not happy with that. She, it turns out, her name is Bix, by the way, has shacked up with a douche named Tim. Yeah, his name really is Tim. I mention that because he will be more douchey and relevant later on. I mean, his name is Tim, so I guess it's fitting. One of my least favourite names. Bix agrees to set up the meeting. Andor leaves, and we get a slightly less pleasing transition, in fact a hard cut, to another flashback sequence, where the kids seem to be preparing for something. I would guess to go and raid the crashed ship. There's good and bad in all of this. Of the good, it already feels like a more believable and sympathetic and genuine community than the Tuskens did in Fett. You are, for the moment at least, left wondering where this particular arc is going, rather than crying actual tears while you wait for it to end. Of the bad, however, derpy young Andor is an astonishingly bad actor, but I don't think he's actually graduated into the category of actor yet. He has no expressions. He gets smacked by a bully and gives the same gormless, distant, bemused look as he gives everything else. Which I think means it's for the best that the show has decided not to linger on these flashbacks, because his scenes kind of subsist on the charity earned by what's around them. Prolonged exposure would burn through that charity with speed. Back at Corpo Command, Khan and another grunt are examining records showing an unidentified ship somewhere in orbit that I'm sure will become relevant later. Meanwhile, Andor is accosted by someone he owes money to. There is a potential problem being stored up here, in that the show doesn't understand that you can have too much of a good thing. What it's trying to do is not only to throw us into the middle of Andor's story, to place him in a developed world with developed interactions and relationships, but to flesh that out to emphasize that point, something I've praised it for hitherto, but with which I think it's beginning to verge on the point of overindulgence. Yes, people's daily lives are indeed rich and varied. Richer and more varied than we usually give them credit for because, after all, we live our own daily lives. We become accustomed to the more mundane and familiar things. For example, as a kid, if your parent asked you how school was that day, you wouldn't say, "Oh, I met Sam," every day. If Sam was your friend and your classmate and that's already established, then it's unremarkable to you. The information is so commonplace that it becomes redundant. This show wants us to realize Andor's daily life, but that means it's stressing commonalities it might have been wiser for it to overlook. You only need to bring in a certain, and usually a small number of ancillary characters and depict a few day-to-day interactions for the audience to accept the point and treat the rest as given. The show doesn't think we're at that point yet. I think the narrative demands that we are at that point already, and the more additional characters and interactions it throws in, the more the show seems padded as opposed to thoughtful. I am all for slow build-ups. In fact, I quite like them. In fact, I think we need more of them. But I'm not for slowness for its own sake, which the show seems, it's at least threatening to move into that territory. And then, of course, the knock-on problem is that it doesn't leave itself enough time to establish more important things, more important relationships between more important characters. So when, in the next scene, Bix goes off on an errand, Tim gets suspicious and follows her, and we're effectively fast-tracked through what we were told just a few minutes ago was merely a nascent hookup. But now, well, Tim is stalking his girlfriend through the streets. That's unexpectedly douchey behavior. Why? Why is he doing this? We know nothing about Tim yet. We know nothing about their relationship yet either. Stalking someone does tell you a good deal about someone's character, yeah, but it risks being a bit jarring if it's just thrown in as like, oh, you know, that's just Tim, that's what he does. Good old Tim, bit of a stalker. It wouldn't have taken that much to mend this. I don't think it's a significant gripe. I think it's a little bit more than a nitpick though, which is why I mention it. If you were just to economize on some of the other interactions, maybe fill that time with a longer exchange, either between Tim and Andor or between Tim and Bix, something that gives us more of his character coming through, it gives the audience then a fuller understanding of just what a douche he is. It establishes that he's a jealous, suspicious sort, rather than just fast-tracking us to that conclusion. We're not seeing the build-up to this, we're just seeing the result of something we don't actually know. Tim walks into a worker though, he knocks some boxes over and loses track of Bix, who goes to a junk shop on the pretext of needing something, but instead climbs up a chimney to send a secret message to somebody. Back at Corpo HQ, Khan is pursuing the investigation Hines told him to drop and being frustrated by his hapless co-workers. We never stay with him all that long, which, by contrast with the preceding, is wise. The show only needs him at this point to remind us from time to time that Andor is still at risk from above. But these short scenes do accomplish good world and character building as well. For Khan, who we increasingly learn is officious and rigorous, and then further development of the Corpo overlords, who are backwater lackeys who really just want an easy life, and then the relationship between Corpo overlords and the seemingly irrelevant and inconsequential planets they govern. And this is all good, efficient stuff. Back on said irrelevant and inconsequential planet, Andor is back at his day job fixing spaceships. It turns out he's been using one of them for his own off-the-books nefarious purposes, and he's quickly running out of credit with his co-workers who have to pretend not to notice or otherwise to lie and cover for him. I think there is actually stuff to praise here too. What the fuck is happening to me? Because what the show is doing is actually a variant of the ticking clock, but it's so subtly done that you wouldn't recognize it as such. Disney Star Wars generally suffers still from the disease it contracted from JJ. It likes its ticking clocks. It's a cheap way of manufacturing high-octane tension and peril. Andor, though, well, that's playing this slowly and subtly. What we're seeing is, to switch the metaphor for a moment, a slow tightening of the net, the investigation from above, the declining charity from below. Andor is a risk-taker. He has placed bets. He's making gambles in his search for his sister, and it's increasingly apparent that he's running out of time and money and grace. His creditors are getting suspicious. They're running out of patience with him. The payoff will undoubtedly be that he's either ensnared in this net or forced out of it at the last minute and out into the galaxy itself. And rarely for Disney Star Wars, and assuming the show keeps this up, that payoff will actually have been earned by its setup. What a shocking suggestion, I know. I appreciate that there are those for whom this might all be a bit too slow, but, and respectfully, I think we're all victims of a kind of media conditioning at this point. Stories, especially Disney Star Wars and Marvel stories, have all operated from the same rulebook for a very long time, one that's designed to keep us attentive, but not interested or really invested. This approach tries to hook us with a quick fix of light and sound and sensory overload. Like a drug, that hit is the point of it. How we get that hit and where it comes from, well, it's much less important when you're craving. Because media is saturated with this kind of thing, because the drug is, so to speak, in the water supply, things that buck that trend or that don't give us these immediate hits induce a kind of withdrawal symptom. We are, after a fashion, drug addicts, and we're addicted whether we like the product or not. You don't have to admire Phase 4 of the MCU, to take just one example, or even to like it very much, to become accustomed to the structure and the tricks the films deploy. Andor is not giving us the fix we have come to expect from media, not yet anyway. And I fear, for some people, that will work against this show. By the same token, I think I have to credit the show for daring to presume that it will be allowed to take the time that it's taking. If it pulls this off, the reward will be much greater for the fact that we've deferred gratification. On the other hand, if it doesn't pull this off, if it gets much worse, if it wastes its setup, if it does any number of things that it could do wrong, well, the pain will be greater because of the time we've sacrificed for the show. So it's taking a risk, but at least it's taking a risk. It's not just carbon copy, cut and paste, cut and shunt, generic mass media. It's doing something different, and it's doing it well so far. Another flashback follows. Derpy young Andor goes off with his friends to hunt for the crashed ship, leaving his sister behind at camp. Her name for him is Kassa, which I think is, or is very close to, the Danish word for scrotum. And on that note, we've hit the end of episode 1, which was, well, it was actually intriguing. Much more so than I assumed it would be. It's the strongest opening to any Disney Star Wars show since The Mandalorian. I don't know that it's stronger than The Mandalorian. Probably not quite, but it is close in its own way. It's certainly much stronger than anything the MCU has given us in Phase 4. Like House of the Dragon, I find myself in the now peculiar and unaccustomed position of wanting to see where Andor is going. And wanting in a genuine sense too, not in the way that a surgeon might find it perversely fascinating to learn what household object he'll have to extract from the arsehole of his next patient. So, given I am intrigued, let's move right on to episode 2. This time, we kick off in the flashback period, with the native kids tracking down the wrecked spaceship. Looking at this with fresh eyes, I'm not sure this premise is as satisfying as it might have been from a world-building point of view. We've had primitive species and races in Star Wars, to be sure, but these have tended to be highly isolated or recently contacted tribes, the Ewoks being the foremost example. We don't see all that much of the tribe of Andor's youth in these flashback scenes. They're clearly aware of other races and civilizations. They clearly see some value in the technology that filters down to them via various means. But unlike the Ewoks, these guys are of the same race or species as the planet's dominant one, assuming of course that there is one. Part of the same race and species that governs the place, and the one that predominates at the top of the Empire itself. So, what are we to make of their origin? Are they outcasts from the main civilization? And if so, would they have regressed to this extent? An underclass origin story wouldn't explain the extent of their backwardness. Mos Eisley is a city of the underclass, and yet it has speeders, spaceports, all kinds of well-worn, hand-me-down but still advanced technology by our standards. The kids of Andor's tribe, by contrast, don't seem that far above the Ewoks in the tech tree. This isn't a fatal flaw in the show by any means, but given it is taking its time establishing its present-day world, you'd hope that it would have at least spent a little bit more time on this one. Perhaps we will get some more fleshing out of the flashback era later on. But, well, at least there are questions to ask of it. Not a flaw, but something we do need to see more if these sequences are to be believable as the mainline plot timeline of the show. That being said, if we were to get more development of the flashback timeline, it would mean that we spend more time watching derpy Andor, and maybe then it's for the best if we don't. Do I feel bad about criticizing a child? Well, on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, nah, fuck 'em. Not in the Disney way. They come upon a vast, seemingly abandoned mine, which looks striking, and I mean that quite genuinely. Though there is something uncanny about it, it almost looks like a painted backdrop, which you wouldn't think would be necessary given the show has demonstrated an admirable commitment to the practical in its sets so far, and there really are mines like this out there in the real world they could have used as a location shot. The other slightly jarring thing about it is that derpy Andor is the only kid to stop and marvel at it, which would seem to suggest that he's never seen it before, and yet all the other kids just walk off as though they've passed it every day of their lives. And it begs once again those questions raised a moment ago about who these people are and what their history is. Are they nomadic, or have they lived beside this thing all their lives? If they've lived in such close proximity to it for a while, why haven't they scavenged more tech from it? And what was their relationship with its owners and its workers? If it was abandoned some time ago, the same question arises. And ditto if they are children of its former employees, and that at this point would be my guess. But hey, it is nice to be asking these kinds of questions about the show, rather than staring on in horror as Boba tries to fly Slave One into another sand vagina. Back in the present, we get a glimpse of a peculiar but not unpleasant dusk ritual, as a man hammers on a ceremonial bell of sorts up in a tower. This isn't a bad touch at all. These kinds of customs are examples of innovation, repurposing familiar icons in the real world and twisting them into something that is equal parts strange but recognizable to us. It's not important at all to the plot or to the story, but it's these kinds of details that mark Andor's world building out from the vast host of far beneath sub-mediocre offerings we've been given in recent years. The workers at the salvage yards hang up their tools. Andor goes off for a stroll. And since I've been praising the show until this point, I should probably balance that out by saying that we're midway through the second episode, and by far the least interesting thing about the show is the character who lends it his name. Andor the show doesn't seem especially interested in Andor the character yet. He's had his introduction, his premise and his goal is established, but little if any personality is being given to him. There are positive as well as negative connotations to this. The time that would traditionally have been spent on the nominal protagonist of the show has instead been spent creating and fleshing out a host of new characters and creating a much fuller world, and this is genuinely pleasing. But at some stage the show will actually need to progress its A-plot along, and at the moment it risks reaching this point with a hollow protagonist. Bix and Tim, fucking Tim, lol, such Star Wars, are closing up their own shop. Tim wants to go out on a date that night, but Bix wants to do it another night. Tim tells her to lock up the back. I think, mate, from the signal she's giving out, she's already well and truly locked up her back already. You're not getting in there, buddy, just take the hint. This is part of Tim's own ruse, though, to get her out of the way. When she's gone, he uses her computer and he sees the message sent by Khan seeking information on the Canary Mail murder suspect. I get the overwhelming sense that I've missed something here, but I've gone back trying to find some connection between Tim and the police earlier in the show, and there just isn't any. He honestly feels like the show's principal and its most egregious contrivance. His ultra-suspiciousness has no setup to it. It's just been forced into the show because, I guess, the writers needed a button to push in case of narrative drift. Oh look, we've gone a bit too long with the colour and the filler. Smash Tim in case of emergency. This is a shame because it's the only standout example so far of really lazy writing. And the thing is, it's kind of duplicating existing mechanics anyway. We already have the world closing in on Cassian from above and below, the police from one side, his exhausted credit from the other. If you're not going to flesh out Tim's character to make his actions and motives explicable, just don't use him as this narrative device. There are plenty of other ways to manufacture this facet of the peril. If the police have sent out this bulletin, have Cassian's friend at the shipyard read it and make the connection, have him threaten to call the cops, have Cassian kill him or otherwise be forced to run, which I'm sure is where we're going anyway. If you are going to use Tim in this manner, you might at least do the groundwork to make it seem like a natural outgrowth of his character, and not just use him as the renter who moves things along whenever the writers get bored. Over with Cassian, he gets home to find his droid keeping an old woman company. Old woman's name is Marva, played by another underappreciated veteran, Fiona Shaw. If Disney's going to turn to experienced English actors with theatre backgrounds rather than drop in Hollywood B-list cameos to fill its worlds, this will be a welcome development because it's a great idea. But because it's a great idea, it almost certainly won't catch on, so enjoy it while you've got it, folks. Old Marv has seen the message from the police. We glean through their interactions that they have a long history together, she and Cassian, that she's a matriarchal, even a maternal figure to him, which makes for another pleasing departure from the norm, because we're very often not allowed to piece character relationships together for ourselves. Normally we're just told all the relevant information at the start of any given scene, because, hey, I guess the audience is just thick as fuck. Cassian goes off to meet Bix in a bar, and she's seen the notice as well. He offers to sell her the kit to buy its way off the planet, but she tells him that her contact is due to arrive tomorrow anyway, so nah. And then, we see that fucking Tim has been spying on them from the bar, and I guess Bix just never looked up, never went to buy another drink, was generally just paying no attention to her surroundings and didn't spot him. I know the show wants us to hate Tim because his character is a jerk, which he is, but I hate him because he's a magnet for shit writing. I hope they kill him off quickly. Anyway, Tim sends a message back to Corpo HQ snitching on Cassian, and they match his name to his lengthy criminal record. Because the show is now dallying around with contrivance, Khan pulls up a hologram of a younger Cassian who looks a little bit like a CGI Tom Cruise, just as Head Prozza from episode 1 turns up. This is far from the worst example of a contrivance you'll ever see, because we do at least know that the Corpos have been investigating this case, but it still feels a bit shoddy compared to much of the rest of the show. It'll be a real shame if it turns out they only spent time patiently building out the world because they don't really know how to write plot convincingly. Bix goes to visit Tim at home, and her clothes fall off and they make out. Now, I lean toward my own kind, but I've absolutely no idea how Tim got her. Tim is a 2 at best. She's at least a 7. She might even be an 8. There must be a severe deficit of eligible bachelors on this planet of metalworkers and labourers, for her to have settled on a podgy spaceman like Tim. It's sure as hell not his winning personality that won her over, because he doesn't have one of those. Maybe she just spends all her time smashed off her tits. But anyway, back at Corpo Command, Khan has summoned in... Is this a young fat bastard from Austin Powers? Anyway, he summoned this ruddy and rotund specimen to go and arrest Cassian. The chap is evidently a fanatic of sorts, a lower league fascist ideologue. So again, there is good and there is bad to mention. His presence adds yet another sensible archetype that does an outsized share of the world building. This is one of those grasping micro-megalomaniacs I mentioned earlier, someone who is probably an unremarkable small-town copper until the New Order empowered him to apply his petty vindictiveness on a larger scale. He as good as makes the point I made earlier when he says that Corpo security is the Empire's first line of defense. Of the bad though, his dialogue lays all this on us about as tactfully as you could imagine him breaking someone's face. The fact I made this point long before the point was spoken to us overtly in the show proves we did not need to be told this overtly in the dialogue. It's a shame when subtle world building is followed up by the expository equivalent of a punch to the face. His spiel about the importance of strong leadership is, only a little less subtly, designed to play up on Khan's aspirations. Here is a man who is voicing the opinions that Khan has hitherto been afraid to speak himself. As a device, it's not a bad thing at all, but again, given the subtlety the show has shown so far, having this chunky chap flatly tell the audience what we've been able to decipher for ourselves already just kind of stands out as unnecessary and disappointingly overt. That's not to say the scene is irredeemable by any means. It starts well enough. It's good to see this new facet of law enforcement, this new truth and understanding of tyrannical regimes finally getting an airing in Star Wars. It does actually flesh out society quite well.
The thought of anything less than full engagement on a case like this.
Unconscionable, sir. Dereliction of duty at the minimum.
It would be, wouldn't it?
I've seen it, sir. Half measures. The take it slow, the wait and see. It's a plague on discipline.
Just hearing this would have been sufficient to reinforce Khan's worldview, but the writers don't seem to have been confident that the audience would have understood this point without having our faces rubbed in it, and so, well, yeah, there is someone's fist in the back of your head and you are having your face rubbed in it. Back on the planet, Andor retrieves his package from its hidey hole on one of the ships he's been working on, which seems a little bit risky given he's not the only employee at the shipyard, not the only person working on the ships, one would presume, but, anyway. He also pulls out what looks suspiciously like Kyle Katarn's blaster, and that is a nice Easter egg. Know what would have been nicer though? Not retconning the EU and actually giving us Kyle Katarn's story on the screen. That would have been fantastic. Such a shame it's unlikely to ever happen. In another flashback, we see the children advance slowly on the wreckage of the ship, as derpy Andor just watches on gormlessly as usual. Then, jumping forward in time again and into orbit, Baron Harkonnen is arriving. Unironically, this show has some excellent cast members in it. They lend gravitas and seriousness, and overall drive home that this is not supposed to be a silly production, and that is most welcome. Bix wakes up and is apparently not met with the sober horror of recognition that she's just slept with Tim. She tells him she has more errands to run, which is usually his invitation to stalk her again or generally do something dickish. Meanwhile, Andor is getting ready to run away, and his droid tries to convince him to stay. I kind of like the droid. It seems and sounds about as depressed as I usually do after watching Disney Star Wars.
You have to go away.
Old Marv comes looking for him, but Cassian has left already. She finds one of the staves we see in the flashbacks with the kids in his bedroom, and that's our invitation to go on another flashback. They find a lot of dead bodies around the crashed ship. A girl advances on the wreckage while Derp watches from a safe distance. This is all he's there for, isn't he? He's just the audience's POV character. He sees one of the seemingly dead people wake up, stand up, and he doesn't think to shout, to alert, to warn anyone. I assume that's what they left him up there for, but nah, he's just derpily watching on. And the newly awoken man shoots the girl in the backside. So the kids poke him full of blow darts? They don't have any business being this primitive, I'm sure they don't. The shot girl is pretty clearly fucked. Not that you'd have got this from Derp's expression, because again, he just looks on as though nothing dramatic has happened at all. He stays behind then, while the other kids take her back to the camp. I think he's supposed to be awkward, or angry, or resentful of something. Our only cue to this is that he clenches his fist and looks back toward the camera, and to the ship. Is he going to go exploring? I'd guess that would be episode 3's flashback. We'll see. In any case, this is our cue to flash forward again. Andor goes to some kind of bus station where we get some slightly forced exposition. The man behind the counter is Googling Canary, having seen the message from Corpo Command, and he reads for the audience's benefit that Canary was an Imperial settlement abandoned after a mining accident. Andor arranges passage. Meanwhile, a space pyramid is hurtling toward them, bearing Khan and Fat Bastard. Fat Bastard gives a mission brief and then invites Khan to give a speech himself, which reveals how unprepared Khan is for the kinetic aspect of his aspirations. And by contrast to the previous scene between these two, I think this one works rather better. Khan talks the talk while he's in the office, but he's now being made to live the ideals he espouses from his position of comfort. And he realizes, and the audience is made to realize, that it's one thing preaching the virtues of order and the smack of firm government from a safe distance, but it's quite another to actually deliver on that in the moment, in person. And he's surrounded by the type of man who enjoys the delivery but has no real time for the ideal. These people are just thugs. He believes that what he's doing is noble. They just give the impression they want to smash some faces. This is a useful distinction to draw. On the planet, Eric Selvig catches a bus into town, and a mustachioed old geezer comes and makes conversation about how things were cheaper back in his day. These days, in a show, you'd expect to see a blue-haired, anorexic, vegan, gender-fluid, soy-secreting communist earnestly preaching the virtues of an economic system that would kill them in seconds, because no way in hell is a vegan surviving manual labor in the gulag. So I guess Andor deserves credit for using an older stereotype from a more civilized age. Though I wonder whether this doesn't constitute bloat. It's not immediately apparent what the point of this exchange is. Eric Selvig doesn't say anything, we don't reveal much about his character, and we don't learn anything about the locale that we didn't already know, unless this man is going to become relevant in some way later, and I don't get the impression he is. Why? I don't really see the point in this. Is this not just dragging things out? Both Baron Harkonnen and Cassian are making their own ways toward the meeting point. The show wants to emphasize this sense of movement, of things coming to a head, but it chooses to do this principally with a thoroughly weird and aberrant trick with its soundtrack. Now it's true, there's been precious little of John Williams' inspiration at all in the score so far. At the moment, I'm not quite decided on the general wisdom of moving away from him, but I think it is forgivable and might even be desirable for the TV shows to be allowed to develop their own distinctive styles. Feature films are another matter. So far, Andor's soundtrack has been unremarkable. Not unpleasant, but not really noticeable. It's been quite minimalist, chiefly composed, get it, of a string section playing ponderous and enigmatic melodies. Some of them have been vaguely pleasant. The rest, though, you just don't really notice it as it happens. The opening theme is nice enough, and on occasion the score has been used to invoke a sense of mystery or tension, but it's never been used to convey pace and tempo. It hasn't been asked to drive events along, until now. And apparently the only way they could think to do it was to go heavy on the percussion, which is, in the first place, it's very fucking cheap, but more importantly, it's so beyond the entire tone and genre and mood of everything else we've heard so far that it just seems completely out of place. It's like having a relaxing evening in with wine and candles and Beethoven. Yes, I'm posh, fuck you very much. Only for your next door neighbor's kid to start murdering the drum kit its parents stupidly bought it for Christmas. The mood is ruined. And it doesn't get any better because the final scene and this fucking abysmal drum hammering continues into the closing credits. It's just make it fucking stop. My God, who decided this was a good idea? It was an appalling choice. It's unfortunate because it ends the episode on an irritating note, while the show itself, well, it still hasn't done that much wrong. Episode 2 has a few more contrivances than its predecessor, but it's otherwise still a sober and deceptively intelligent thing. That being said, you can see why they chose to drop 3 episodes in one go. Watching these back-to-back is a much better experience than watching them intermittently. Had this been a weekly release, I'm sure I'd not be so forgiving of its pacing. I was going to say that this is an outdated form of criticism, because of course, the new rules of streaming entertainment don't constrain studios to a consistent release schedule. There's nothing innately wrong or disruptive about releasing 3 episodes at once, and then reverting to a weekly release thereafter. But it does at least pose questions about the studio's decision-making. Why release these as 3 separate episodes on one day, rather than kick the show off with one 90-minute episode to get things moving, and then revert to shorter weekly episodes? Could it be that the plan was originally to release these one at a time, but test screenings or focus grouping revealed that the audience didn't think there was enough to latch onto in episodes 1 and 2? That would be my guess, and if it were a weekly release, I would agree. But it is just a guess. Unlike certain other channels, I can't just wheel out leakers to confirm every one of my suppositions. Episode 3 will have to move things along though. I think we've done as much build-up as we can reasonably expect to get away with. Any more would invite accusations of time-filling and padding and self-indulgence. So, with that in mind, let's get on to episode 3. This one kicks off with another flashback, and Derp is indeed climbing into the crashed ship. He's still prodding his staff about, though you might think, given what he just saw happen, he might have picked up a blaster from one of the corpses. Apparently his tribe of children have an aversion to any tech that might conceivably be useful, but then that opens the question, what were they even doing here? He goes exploring the interior, though again it's not especially clear why or what he's looking for, what they hope to find in there. He sees himself in the mirror and makes an unwise attempt to act, then he gets angry at himself because he can't, and he smashes his reflection. I know I've ummed and ahed about what or how much we should be getting from these scenes. I think the problem is that the show itself isn't too sure what it wants to give us from them. If it's aiming to fill in Andor's backstory, it's not doing an especially good job of it. We gain precious little understanding about his character. It's a bit of a leap even to assume that he's angry in this scene because of what he just saw happen, since the show doesn't do a good job of portraying the girl getting shot as anything like a failure on his part. We have to assume, I suppose, that he was meant to be on guard and instead watched silently as his friend got shot, but then we also have to assume that she's a friend to begin with and that nobody else was on guard. If that is what the show was aiming for, well, it just hasn't framed it very well. If, on the other hand, we're supposed to establish why his sister went missing, we're spending rather a lot of time pissing about away from her, covering events that aren't anything like as important to the setup of the present-day arc. My impression is the writers had both of these things in mind, but not clearly, and without making either one a firm priority. Perhaps it's just that the acting is atrocious, so we don't glean the things that should be obvious to us. In any event, the flashback scenes had more promise than I think they've been able to deliver on. Unless, of course, the show's going to throw us a curveball and deliver something else entirely. Watch that space. Back in the present day, though, we get an impressive shot of some major construction site in operation. Cassian is here to meet the friend he used to establish his alibi in episode 1. Andor tells him he has the money he owes him. Apparently he owes money to everyone in this town, and he will leave it with old Marv. And he asks friend to take care of her before promising, "I'll be back. I'll find a way." Here is evidence of that issue I raised earlier, of the show reaching the point of plot progression without having done much of anything to flesh out its protagonist. We don't really have any sense of Andor's relationship with this place. If anything, he doesn't seem very happy here. The show is actually borrowing from a couple of Disney-era Star Wars setups. Cassian here is in much the same role as Cal Kestis was in Fallen Order, and Han Solo in Solo. But in both cases, yes, even in fucking Solo, we get a clearer idea of each character's relationship with the place they live in and their want or need to leave it than we get from Andor. In this show, we know that Cassian lives here, we know he wants to go and find his sister, but we don't know what he feels about this place or why he should, as expressed here, want to go about making solemn promises to return if he can. What's tying him to this place? Why would he want to come back? Why does it particularly matter to him? Would he not want to use his newfound freedom to try his luck with his sister, not in that way, elsewhere in the galaxy, once he's found her? Baron Harkonnen's bus arrives, and the fairly redundant old chap from the previous episode bids him farewell. He meets up with Bix, who tells him about the security bulletin, which doesn't concern the Baron much at all because the official record, after all, states that Cassian is not from Kenari, so they have a bit of an argument as to how accurate that record will be and whether anyone else besides them knows that the Imperial record is not accurate. The space pyramid then arrives in orbit. And as is so often the case with this show, we get something good and something bad in the same shot. The pyramid ship itself does not look particularly Star Wars-y. It's a peculiar and clunky design choice, and it just doesn't seem to fit, as it were, ergonomically with the galaxy it's set in. The transports it deploys, on the other hand, actually do pay heed to established design types, and they fit the time period the show's set in, borrowing, as they do, quite heavily from the shape and design of the Republic's LA-AT gunships, with their wing shape in particular. Maybe they've borrowed the pyramid ship from somewhere, some old EU design that I'm just not familiar with. But if they haven't, that's disappointing and unnecessary, given there are so many established and mass-produced ships they might have been able to use. Hell, wouldn't the Empire have flogged off some of its old acclimators to regional security forces as its own navy advanced? What about all the decommissioned separatist ships? Wouldn't local security have found a use for those? That might have been a nice touch, as well as a way to firmly anchor this show in its time place and do more subtle world building. As the dropships enter orbit, we see Andor's droid rolling along the street, and then we get a very peculiar cut to same droid rolling through the interior of what seems to be the crashed ship from the flashback scene, with old Marv and some other bloke behind it. And this is kind of a triple take moment, and I'm still not sure on a first watch just where they are, how they got there, when they got there, or why they're there. But then it becomes clear, in the next scene, they're hunting for scraps and tech, we are in fact back in time, it's the flashback sequence again, they've arrived on the ship from that flashback sequence. Now, it's obvious after you've seen both scenes, but if you're watching it just on a first look, there's no clear delineation until that subsequent scene, where we find Derp smashing up the control room for no good reason. You see the droid in one place and you see the droid in the other. So we've got a problem upon a problem here. A, the audience has been yanked out of a build-up moment in the present, the descending of the dropships, to a flashback sequence we don't initially realize is a flashback, because none of the characters appear much different, if different at all, than they do in the present day. Your first question is just, wait, what? Where are we now? And then we have a contrivance. The show has already not done enough to explain why Derp is in the ship, or why he's particularly angry at himself or his surroundings, but now it turns out that he's angry because the show just kind of needs him to remain in place long enough to manufacture a meeting between Derp and old Marv. She didn't age horribly. In fact, she aged incredibly well, because while Andor ages in the intervening period from about age 12 to age 35, Marv just goes from about 66 to 67? And even that might be a bit too harsh. This does, or will, explain the maternal relationship old Marv has with Cassian later. But in a more egregious way even than Tim's stalking and general extreme douchey behavior, the show has been very sloppy with how it got here. Derp, for little discernible reason, entered the ship on his own, got angry, stayed angry, and proceeded to pointlessly smash apart the room just long enough for old Marv to turn up in a bizarrely and distractingly placed flashback sequence to meet him there. This is not, put politely, especially satisfying writing. Despite being part of a tribe that seems hyper-cautious about strangers, Derp doesn't think it worthwhile to stop or even react as the door beside him opens and two random old strangers walk in, though if we're feeling kind, we can dismiss this as red mist or tunnel vision, his anger preventing him from noticing at first, even if the anger is still fucking inexplicable. Eventually he does notice, and the droid starts to translate his weird language for the benefit of the old folks, but then we cut back to the present and the dropships again. And this sequence looks pretty good for the most part. The ships themselves, glimpses of the world we see through the cockpit windows, all this looks pleasingly real, and they blend seamlessly enough with the ever-impressive practical set that they arrive in, something that Rings of Power routinely fails to accomplish, as I'll come on to in my next video on that shit show, despite having, presumably, a much bigger budget. We're getting much more frequent and intrusive flashbacks now though, because no sooner have the ships landed than we're back in the past again. Old Marv trying to befriend Derp, who refuses to play along, so she drugs him into submission. Absolutely no Disney jokes will here be made. And then we're back in the present again as the Corpo thugs turn up and burst into her house looking for Cassian. They ransack the place, but Marv refuses to tell them where Cassian is, so they try torturing the poor droid? Inconveniently for the characters, but very conveniently for the writers, the droid has a transmitter, and Cassian chooses this precise moment to radio a message over, asking the droid to tell Marv that he's sorry, and then droning on long enough for Fat Bastard to trace the message using some nifty piece of kit we've never seen before and we will likely never see again. And I'm sorry to say that though the scene is acted well and it does convey tension as intended, it does not constitute good writing. A, Cassian has been the most cautious about being investigated or hunted by the authorities, building alibis and asking the droid to lie for him. Yet he leaves the droid, which is known to be unreliable anyway, with a transmitter that could be linked to him. B, having left the droid with the transmitter, the droid that lives in the one place the police were likely to search first, he decides to use the transmitter to send a completely unnecessary message to old Marv and risk being discovered. C, he gets in touch at the precise moment the police have arrived, interrogating Marv and the droid. That seems highly fucking lucky to me, or unlucky from his perspective. And D, Fat Bastard just happens to have in his belt the one tool that can track the location of precisely this kind of signal from precisely this kind of transmitter, meaning the Corpo goons know exactly where to go and find him. Yeah, that also sounds incredibly fucking lucky to me. Is it the worst writing on TV even this week? No, not by a long shot, because there's another 3 or 4 weeks of Rings of Power left. Can you overlook it? Yeah, I guess you can if you want to. But the show has until this point been inviting you to pay attention because it's been trying to convey messages and setups with a degree of subtlety and finesse. It's been good so far because it's invited you to turn your brain on and keep it switched on. The writers can't complain now if this massive moment for the plot requires that you immediately switch your brain off again for it to be passable, and if the viewer then isn't prepared to do that. I fear I may have been right about them dallying because they're not actually that good at writing action or events. But yeah, it's still early days. It's not a fatal failure. Perhaps the show will redeem itself. It's earned enough credit so far that it can afford to make the occasional faux pas, even if those faux pas are more noticeable precisely because they fall below a high standard that the show has set for itself. An angry crowd is forming outside the house, but we cut away then to Cassian's meeting with Eric Selvig, and then back again to the angry crowd, and then back again to the meeting, where they're haggling over price and questioning each other's honesty. We cut away again, back to town, where some guy I don't remember or recognize runs to tell Bix what's going down. And, well, I've been referring to the Corpos as Corpos just because, but apparently that's their in-universe moniker too. I wonder if the writers have been playing Cyberpunk while they were writing the show. Bix goes to try and find Cassian, but Tim tries to stop her and lets slip that it was him who ratted Andor out to the authorities, and that pisses her off. And we might have felt a bit more about this revelation of Tim being an established character rather than a plot-convenient c***. Back in the abandoned warehouse, they are still haggling over price. Selvig wants to know how Cassian got the box, and Cassian explains that he essentially blagged his way into an Imperial base because the Empire is so arrogant that they couldn't even conceive of a poor person duping them in this way. Well, maybe. It is increasingly irritating the way in which the Empire is portrayed as a collection of the biggest fucking idiots in the galaxy whenever the plot of a Disney Star Wars show needs an explanation for how one of its protagonists won an implausible victory against it. To Andor's credit, it at least attempts to give us a believable explanation, one that kind of conforms with its established world building, if, that is, you're prepared to make a few key assumptions. Number 1, that the box is of minimal, perhaps only regional importance to the Empire. Number 2, that the box was located in a regional or contracted security corps base, not anywhere especially significant. And then number 3, that it is a relatively commonplace device, important to those lower down the pecking order than Imperial forces, but not especially important to the Empire itself. You are also expected to forgive that this is essentially mystery box writing. If we are, again, being kind, we can say that the version of the story Cassian gives is vague enough for us to make these assumptions, or if we believe the box is more important than I've just laid out, which it seems to be, given it's essentially an all-purpose cloaking device cum navigation system that allows you to detect and evade Imperial ships, well, maybe there's rather more to the story of its acquisition than Cassian revealed to us. None of these are impossible assumptions to make, and yet it is another instance of the plot relevant, as opposed to the world-building scenes, requiring a much more strident attempt at suspending disbelief. Disbelief that's necessary both for the plot to work and for some of the more distant world-building to remain intact. For if this box is top secret, ultra-rare, hyper-important kit to the Empire itself, then pretending it was possible to steal it just because the Empire is dumb and complacent makes the Empire itself much less of a threat than it should be. Andor has shown us that the Empire's corpo subordinates, its contract workers, its regional offices, are pretty sloppy. That is believable. But knowing this, as the Empire must if it is to be competent, why would it have left such an important piece of tech in a backwater outpost to begin with? Anyway, Eric Selvig agrees with Andor's characterization of them. The Empire is indeed full of arrogant, lazy shit weasels who just don't pay attention to the little guy. But he seems at this stage rather more interested in Cassian himself, and then reveals that he knows quite a lot about Cassian, including who killed his father and where and why, meaning he wasn't here for the mystery box at all. He's in fact here to recruit Cassian. He is here, the strong implication is, to recruit him to the Rebel Alliance. Back in town, people begin banging on random bits of metal, which seems to trigger a kind of local coordinated lockdown. This is dismissed by Fat Bastard as an attempted intimidation tactic, all huff and bluster, while back in the warehouse, Cassian hands over the comlink he should never really have had on him, which Selvig then destroys. Never carry anything you can't control, he says, even as he recruits a man he barely knows and can't possibly expect to control either. Consistency. We don't really need it, do we? Back in town, Bix is arrested, and then in the warehouse, a shootout ensues. Cassian tries to retrieve the mystery box, and bits of scenery go flying about because Selvig apparently put mines on the doors on his way in. It's the show's first proper action sequence, and, well, it's not bad. But there's too much reliance on convenient and lucky environmental hazards for my taste. Though things then become a little bit less convenient for our protagonists when more scenery decides it's had enough of fighting gravity and the whole place collapses. Back in town, Bix tries to escape but gets twatted into a wall. Then, conveniently, or not for him, Tim turns up. And because nothing else about his character has been earned or is consistent, I guess this doesn't need to be either. He is consistently inconsistent. Here, he gets very annoyed at the Corpo grunts that he himself summoned here after spying on Bix in order to dob in her friend, because she now has a cut on her head because the Corpo grunts are bad now. So he charges at them in a fit of uncharacteristic chivalry, and he gets himself shot. Fuck you, Tim. Just fuck off. You can't even die satisfyingly. But hey, I guess we've given Bix a reason to join the rebellion later. The grunts make to leave, but then Fat Bastard receives word that Selvig and Cassian are heading back, so they turn around and take up positions and wait for them to arrive because they seem to be assuming that these two fugitives who are being shot and chased by Corpo security, they'll just obligingly walk back into town in plain view, that they think these people are Cad fucking Bane. Old Marv plays psychological warfare with a couple of the grunts who are hiding in her house. Meanwhile, townsfolk are continuing to bang rhythmically on bits of metal. She tells the guards that they might want it to stop, but it's when it stops that they should really start to worry. And this scene plays out, reasonably for now. I don't think it's paced itself well enough to elicit the kind of tension it's clearly trying to build up, but it is creating at least a semblance of its desired atmosphere, and the increasingly nervous Corpo grunts portray their emotions effectively enough. Then, the banging does stop. Some of the grunts run outside for no very good reason. Cassian then appears behind Khan and makes him drop his weapon. Selvig wants to kill him, hinting at this darker nature to the formation of the rebellion that I'm sure we'll explore more in later episodes. But then Khan gives them some useful information, so they let him go, while another grunt makes it back to a dropship. He goes to fly away, only to find somebody has chained it to a massive rock, which swings around and gets tangled, and the ship crashes and explodes. It looks kind of cool, I guess. The point the show is attempting to push is that the Corpo grunts might nominally be in control of this sector, but they aren't really. The people here hate them. They are strangers in a strange land, and, well, look, I suppose it is possible to expect too much of any series, but for all the slow world building the show did in its first episodes, I'm not sure it ever gave us enough to justify this. But I'm also not sure it knows what this is. Most of the people here are presumably employed by the corporation they are here unanimously rebelling against. They seem to have a well-rehearsed plan that they put into operation as soon as the Corpo grunts arrive. The show wants, I think, to portray this as our first introduction of the rebel spirit, but we haven't really been given all that much to show it fermenting. What happens to these people once their employer learns they've been complicit in the murder, as they will see it, of their entire security team? What about all those people who probably quite like the corporation, given it pays them their salary, and it gives them their jobs, and it probably built their houses? The show realistically depicted the nuances of factional control, the difference between naive ideologues, their masters in the Empire, the grunts beneath them who just take any excuse to impose brutality. But we're supposed to believe the inhabitants of an entire town, of an entire city, even of an entire planet maybe, they're all uniform in their views? And if so, why? For what reason? Besides the couple of aggressive drunks at the beginning of episode 1, we've not seen much evidence of systemic violence and suppression. It's beginning to feel like the genuinely good work that did go into the construction of some aspects of this world would have been better directed at other aspects that could actually explain more relevant parts of the world, parts that are more relevant to this episode, to the payoff on this planet, like the rebellion, the uprising against the corporate grunts by the population. Then there is the second issue, the slightly more immediate and shallower issue. We've just had a portentous warning from old Marv about what happens when the banging, the drumming stops. But what happens when it does stop? I mean, nothing. You're sort of led to believe that there might be a mass uprising of armed civilians against them, like the town will go to war with the Corpo guards, but that doesn't happen. The banging stops, and that's it. Like, the people don't do anything they haven't already done. We see the chain attached to the dropship, that causes some damage, but that was done way before. That was done when the banging was still going on. The population of the town don't do anything when the banging stops. All that happens is that Cassian and Selvig hop in a speeder and race away. Except that couldn't have been part of the plan, that couldn't have been the ominous thing to which Marv was referring, because there was no way the townsfolk could have got this plan together on the assumption that two people they didn't know would be involved would hop in a speeder in circumstances they couldn't have foreseen. I don't know what she was referring to. Anyway, we are led to believe Cassian and Selvig hop in a speeder and race away. The speeder, however, gets shot and then it explodes, but not to worry, it was all a ruse, because they then appear from around a corner on a speeder bike and the guards obligingly don't shoot at them. And then Selvig, who apparently has a knack for spawning bombs whenever and wherever they are most convenient, blows up half a street and they escape. Okay then. I'm not sure if I've used the word yet in this review, but I'm obliged to say this is a little bit silly. We get then a moving enough flashback to old Marv carrying unconscious Derp away from the ship, interspliced with her crying in the present, and this does work, even if, once again, the show might have benefited from spending a bit more time on their relationship in the present, and some less time on the ancillary characters. The remainder of the episode plays out as a montage of after effects, essentially, past and present. Corpo grunts surveying the damage, Marv carrying Derp away from the ship in the past, Andor and Selvig leaving the planet in the present. Mercifully, no stupid drum track on this occasion, just more of the show's fairly pleasant if not particularly memorable score. Past and present mirror each other. It's like poetry. It rhymes. And that's the end of episode 3, bringing us up to date, at the time of recording anyway. This is a curious show. I'm in the slightly peculiar, and I gather anyway, the slightly unorthodox position of actually preferring its first 2 episodes to its third, though many of the problems with its third stem from those first 2 episodes. At times, it's a thoughtful show. At times, it's just ponderous. It's always serious. And it doesn't think its audience is uniformly thick as shit, which is a pleasant change. It has some of the most intricate and careful world building Star Wars has done in years, if not in decades. It's visually striking. Its preference for practical sets where possible pays off. It creates a well-realized backwater town, governed by a well-reasoned, nuanced, and believable corporate governorship. It wisely expands the Empire beyond its most immediate visual identifiers. There are no stormtroopers here, not yet anyway. It does a good job filling out the bottom of society under Imperial rule. Its problems are, principally, that the world building it seemed most interested in ended up being the least relevant to Episode 3's culmination. An awful lot of work was put in, but the payoff didn't use anything like enough of that work. Andor's scope of safety, his time, was portrayed as closing in on him from both beneath and above, him losing the trust and the friendship of his neighbors and co-workers, as well as being hunted by the Corpo guards. And yet, rather than make use of the former, which would have been the most interesting approach to take, the events of Episode 3 were just conjured into being by Tim, who was barely even a character, and then, of course, by a mystery box, which proved not to be all that relevant besides as an excuse to get 2 characters into the same room at the same time. Divorced from context, Episode 3 was enjoyable, without competition the most high-octane of the 3 we've seen so far. It suggests the writers can do action sequences alongside, if not quite as well as, the world building, but the problem comes in their attempts, or the lack thereof, to marry these 2 things together. I can't answer the question posed at the beginning about whether or not the show has mingled politics in with its storytelling, other than to say that at the moment there hasn't been any forced politicking in the first 3 episodes. That then remains an open question. Will this show lapse into using the Empire as allegory, as some think it will or want it to do? It would be a great shame if it did, but it would be an especial shame, I think, because without it, and if certain issues can be ironed out, and if world building and action sequences can be better married together, there is actually the potential for a pretty good show in all of this. I'm not with those who think that this was either a generic sci-fi show or insufficiently resemblant of Star Wars. I think, provided we get more of a tie-in later, as all hints suggest that we will, this will go down as a pretty effective expansion of the on-screen universe, showing us things that must exist below the societal levels we've seen on screen so far, but that we've not actually seen on screen so far. If you compare it to other recent Star Wars offerings, it is by far the best of the bunch, not as loving or perhaps as gripping as The Mandalorian's opening was, but more intelligent and less derivative. With a broader and less specific comparator, I can only say that the show has potential to be quite good. The fact it still has that potential, the fact it hasn't squandered it yet, means the conclusion has to be the show has got off to a pretty good start, despite its sillier moments and its undoubted problems. The test then will be in its future. But hey, at least it has the prospect of passing that test. At least I'm wondering if it will fuck me up the wrong'un, rather than bending over and wincing as I imagine the new ways in which it is about to fuck me up the wrong'un. Realistically, I am not going to manage episodic reviews alongside the day job and Rings of Power, but I do intend to come back to Andor. It's piqued my interest. It's got me intrigued. I will watch its career with great interest.